The birth of an empire. Around 5,000 years ago, Egypt was divided in two regions along the Nile River. The two regions were governed by different kings. Later, both regions were unified and had a single king called the Pharaoh. Egypt then became a great empire. The Nile River. Egypt is a warm, sunny country, covered mostly by a big desert. In ancient Egypt, life depended on the Nile River. All the cities were along the river. The Nile River floods every year in June, and the land becomes fertile. In ancient Egypt, everyone was happy when the river flooded, and there were great celebrations. Farmers planted their grain, and there was more food for the people and animals. The people. The population was divided into nobles, skilled workers, and field hands. Priests and scribes were the only ones who could write. Craft workers, such as masons, jewelers, and shoemakers, lived in the villages. Farmers grew food and raised cattle. Ancient Egyptians believed in another life after death, called the afterlife. The afterlife was as important as life. They thought they needed their bodies after they died, so they preserved them. They built tombs with all the objects that the dead person used in life and might need in the afterlife. The ancient Egyptian life. The Egyptians were advanced people. They built pyramids, monuments, and temples. They wrote in hieroglyphs, which are signs or pictures that make up a written language. They painted scenes of the life of pharaohs, the people in the cities, and the country people. They built the pyramids as tombs for the dead pharaohs. Within each pyramid, they painted scenes which told about the pharaoh's life. The discovery of a famous tomb. In 1922, an English archaeologist discovered the tomb of a young pharaoh, Tutankhamun. The tomb was in the Valley of Kings, where most of the pharaohs were buried. When the explorers opened the tomb, they found statues, objects, and solid walls of gold. They also found the sarcophagus with Tutankhamun's mummy. Everything the pharaoh would need in his afterlife was there. There were chairs, couches, eating and cooking utensils, clothing, tools, and even a bunch of flowers. There were also statues of his servants, shrines to various gods, and chests of gold jewelry. Mummies and mummification. The ancient Egyptians created a method to preserve the human body after death. This method was called mummification. Mummification was a long process executed by an expert, the embalmer. At the end of the process, the body was smaller and thinner and became a mummy. The mummy was then wrapped with bands of linen and put in a special box called the sarcophagus. Only rich people were mummified. The poor were buried in the sand. Pyramids, monuments, and temples. The stone tombs of the pharaohs, the pyramids, are all built on the west bank of the Nile, where the sun sets. The four sides of the pyramid face north, south, east, and west. They all have many chambers and passages. All of the pyramids were built by hand. Today, scientists still study how they were built. The ancient Egyptians also built very large temples, like the Temple of Luxor, with impressive columns and hieroglyphs carved on them. The most famous monument of ancient Egypt is the Sphinx, which has the body of a lion and a human head. The Egyptian gods. The Egyptians had hundreds of gods who protected them in their lives and afterlives. Often, the gods were represented by a human body with an animal head. Ra was the god of the sun and had the head of a falcon. Horus also had the head of a falcon. He was the god of the sky. Bastet was the goddess of protection and had the head of a cat. Geb was the earth god and had the head of a goose. The ancient Egyptians believed that earthquakes were Geb's laughter. Hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs used pictures to represent different things. There were more than 700 hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs were carved on stone or written with pen and ink on papyrus, a kind of paper made out of a plant. We can read this writing thanks to the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone is a stone with writing on it in 2 different languages, hieroglyphs and ancient Greek. It works like a dictionary because the text that praises the pharaoh is written in both languages. It took years, but by using the Greek, people were able to understand and translate the hieroglyphs. Everyday life. Because of the warm weather and the plentiful crops, life in Egypt was easy and pleasant. Young children went naked, and when they were older, they wore linen clothes. Men used a skirt-like cloth, and women wore dresses. Both men and women liked to use blue or green eyeshadow and black eyeliner. They used jewelry representing the gods, and they loved lucky charms called amulets. The Egyptians grew crops of grain. They made bread and beer. They also grew fruit, such as figs and grapes, and vegetables, such as onions, leeks, cabbages, beans, cucumbers, and lettuce. They also made linen and papyrus out of plants. They had wooden and copper tools. They kept animals, such as cattle, pigs, goats, ducks, and geese. They also fished in the Nile and sometimes went to the desert to hunt wild animals. The greatness of the Egyptian Empire. The Egyptians had a powerful army, but they preferred a peaceful and beautiful life. They enjoyed telling stories such as the story of Osiris and Isis, the parents of Horus. They loved the religious life, painting, playing music, and dancing. The center of the Egyptian Empire was first in the city of Memphis and later in Thebes. The most well-known pharaoh of Thebes was Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. He ruled for over 60 years. The fall of an empire. The Greeks conquered Egypt, and later the Romans made Egypt a part of their empire. The last pharaoh was Cleopatra VII, who had a son with the Roman Julius Caesar. After Cleopatra, Egypt became part of the Roman Empire. Ancient Egypt remains as one of the greatest civilizations in history.